The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital room as David Matthews sat beside his father's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of the old man's chest. At 78, Robert Matthews had lived through wars, economic crashes, and personal tragedies that would have broken lesser men. Now, as cancer slowly claimed his body, he seemed smaller somehow, more fragile than David had ever imagined possible. "Come closer, son," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle hum of medical equipment. David leaned in, catching the familiar scent of aftershave mixed with antiseptic that had become his father's signature in recent weeks. "I need to tell you something important," Robert continued, his weathered hand reaching for David's. "Something I should have shared years ago." David felt a chill run down his spine. His father had always been a man of few words, choosing action over conversation, demonstrating love through provider rather than poetry. This sudden urgency to communicate felt both precious and terrifying. "What is it, Dad?" David asked, settling more comfortably in the uncomfortable plastic chair that had become his second home over the past month. Robert's eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, fixed on his son's face. "You know I wasn't much good with words when you were growing up. Your mother, God rest her soul, she was the one who read you bedtime stories and helped with homework. I was always working, always trying to build something better for our family." David nodded, remembering those long evenings when his father would return home exhausted from the construction site, dirt under his fingernails and concrete dust in his hair. Even then, Robert would always make time to ask about David's day, even if the conversation lasted only a few minutes before fatigue claimed him. "But there were things I wanted to tell you," Robert continued, his grip on David's hand tightening slightly. "Words I practiced in my head during those long drives to work sites. Advice I meant to give you when you graduated, when you got married, when little Emma was born." The mention of David's 5-year-old daughter brought tears to both men's eyes. Emma had been the light of Robert's life in his final years, the granddaughter who could make him laugh even on his worst days. "I kept telling myself there would be more time," Robert said, his voice growing stronger with emotion. "More birthdays, more family dinners, more chances to say the things that matter. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers like sand, David. One day you're 35 and invincible, the next you're lying in a hospital bed realizing you've wasted too many opportunities to speak from the heart." David felt his throat tighten. His relationship with his father had always been solid, built on mutual respect and unspoken understanding. They had shared countless moments working together on home projects, attending baseball games, and simply existing in comfortable silence. But Robert was right about the words left unspoken. "You turned out better than I ever dreamed," Robert said suddenly, surprising David with the directness of the compliment. "Not because of anything I did or didn't do, but because of who you chose to become. You're a better father to Emma than I was to you, a better husband to Sarah than I was to your mother in many ways." "Dad, you were a great father," David protested, but Robert waved away the objection with a weak gesture. "I was adequate," Robert said with a slight smile. "I kept food on the table, a roof over our heads, and I loved you fiercely, even when I didn't know how to show it. But I wasn't present the way you are with Emma. I didn't understand then that providing financially was only part of the job. Conversation was interrupted by a nurse checking Robert's vitals, giving both men a moment to process the emotional weight of the discussion. David studied his father's face, noticing details he had somehow missed before. The way Robert's eyes crinkled when he was thinking deeply, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the gray stubble that spoke of a man too tired to maintain his usual meticulous grooming habits. When they were alone again, Robert reached for a small leather journal on his bedside table. David recognized it immediately as the notebook his father had carried for years, always jotting down measurements, phone numbers, or random thoughts. He had never imagined it contained anything deeply personal. "I've been writing in this for the past 2 months," Robert explained, handling the journal with reverence. All the things I wanted to tell you over the years. Stories about your grandfather that I never shared. Lessons I learned too late to teach you properly. Dreams I had for your future that I was too proud or too scared to voice. David's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the journal. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and he could see pages filled with his father's careful handwriting. Don't read it now, Robert said quickly. Save it for when you need guidance, when you're facing difficult decisions, or when you want to remember that your old man wasn't completely hopeless with words after all. The weight of the journal in David's hands felt enormous, as if it contained decades of compressed love and wisdom. He looked up to find his father watching him with an expression of hope, mixed with vulnerability that he had never seen before. There's something else, Robert said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. Again, something I need you to promise me. David leaned closer, prepared to agree to anything his dying father might request. Don't make my mistake, Robert said urgently. Don't wait until it's too late to say the important things. Emma needs to hear your words, not just see your actions. Sarah needs to know not just that you love her, but why you love her, how she makes your world better, what she means to your soul. The simplicity and truth of the request hit David like a physical blow. He realized that he had indeed inherited his father's tendency toward quiet love, toward assuming that actions spoke louder than words. But listening to Robert now, seeing the regret in his eyes, David understood that both were necessary. I promise, Dad, David said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll find the words. Robert smiled then, the first genuine smile David had seen in weeks, and settled back into his pillows with what looked like relief. 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, David found himself standing in his father's empty house, surrounded by a lifetime of accumulated memories. The silence felt overwhelming after years of visiting a home filled with his father's presence. Sarah had offered to help with the sorting, but David needed to do this alone, to say goodbye to the man who had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The house smelled like coffee and wood polish, scents that would forever remind him of Saturday morning visits with Emma. She had loved exploring Grandpa's workshop, fascinated by the neat rows of tools and the projects in various stages of completion. Robert had been teaching her to measure and cut wood, patient in a way that surprised everyone who knew his typically gruff demeanor. David made his way to the kitchen table where he had left his father's journal 3 weeks earlier, unable to open it during the chaos of funeral arrangements and well-meaning visitors. Now, with the house quiet and his emotions finally stable enough to handle whatever revelations awaited, he carefully opened the worn leather cover. The first page contained a simple inscription. For David, the son who taught an old dog that it's never too late to learn new tricks. These words come from a heart that was always full of love, even when my mouth forgot how to express it. What followed was unlike anything David had expected. Instead of formal advice or stern life lessons, the pages contained intimate glimpses into Robert's inner world. Stories about David's childhood that revealed how closely his father had been paying attention, even when he seemed distracted by work pressures. The day you scored your first goal in soccer, one entry read, I wanted to run onto that field and lift you up on my shoulders. Instead, I stood on the sideline clapping like a proper parent should. But inside, I was bursting with pride. You looked so determined, so focused. I saw myself in you that day. But I also saw something better. You had my drive, but you also had your mother's grace. David found himself laughing through tears as he read about moments he had forgotten but his father had treasured. The time 7-year-old David had tried to fix a leaky faucet to surprise Robert when he came home from work, flooding the bathroom in the process. Instead of anger, Robert had felt grateful that his son wanted to help, wanted to learn the skills. That defined his father's world. I should have hugged you instead of lecturing about water damage, the journal revealed. You were trying to be like me, which was the greatest compliment a man could receive from his son. Page after page revealed similar insights. Robert had noticed everything. David's first heartbreak, his struggle with math in high school, his nervousness before his wedding day. But instead of addressing these moments directly, Robert had chosen to love quietly from a distance, assuming his son would simply know how he felt. One entry particularly caught David's attention. David asked me today why I never talk about my father. I told him there wasn't much to say, but that's not true. There's too much to say, and I don't know where to start. My father was a hard man who lived through hard times. He showed love by working himself to death to provide for us. I swore I would be different, more present, more expressive. But here I am, making the same mistakes, keeping the same silence. The pattern continues, and I hate myself for it. This revelation stunned David. He had always assumed his grandfather was simply a man of his generation, stoic and practical. He had never considered that Robert might have struggled with the same communication barriers that now seemed to define their family line. Further into the journal, David found detailed observations about Emma that made his heart ache. Robert had documented her first words during visits, her favorite games, the questions she asked that revealed her growing understanding of the world. Most touching were Robert's predictions about who she might become. Emma has her grandmother's curiosity and her father's determination, one entry noted. But she also has something we Matthews men have always struggled with, the ability to express joy openly. Yesterday she told me I was her favoriteest grandpa in the whole wide world. I wanted to tell her she was my favoriteest granddaughter, but the words felt too big for my mouth. Instead, I just smiled and ruffled her hair. Why is it so hard to match her honesty with my own? As David continued reading, he began to see patterns in his own behavior that he hadn't recognized before. The way he deflected Sarah's emotional conversations with practical solutions. The times he had felt proud of Emma's accomplishments, but expressed it through nods and good jobs, rather than the enthusiastic celebrations she deserved. The journal contained an entire section titled, "Words I Wished I'd Said," filled with conversations Robert had imagined having with David over the years. Discussions about love, failure, ambition, and fear that could have bridged the emotional distance between them. When you were 16 and that girl broke your heart, one entry read, I wanted to tell you that heartbreak proves you're capable of loving deeply, which is one of the most important qualities a man can possess. I wanted to share that I was heartbroken 3 times before I met your mother, and each experience taught me something valuable about what I really needed in a partner. Instead, I made you a sandwich and told you there were plenty of fish in the sea. Such a waste of a teachable moment. David found himself wishing desperately that he could have these conversations now, could tell his father that the silent support had mattered too, that Robert's steady presence had been its own form of communication. But reading these intimate thoughts also gave him something precious. Insight into a man who had loved deeply, but struggled to find the words to express it. Near the end of the journal, the entries became more urgent, written after Robert's diagnosis when he realized time was running short. These pages contained direct advice for David's future, guidance for raising Emma, and expressions of love that took David's breath away. You are the best thing I ever accomplished, one entry declared. Not the houses I built or the successful business I ran, but the man you became despite my failures in communication. You have a gentle strength that I always admired but never learned to emulate. Don't let my example teach you to keep your heart locked away. Emma and Sarah deserve to know the depth of your love for them. The final entry was dated just 2 days before Robert's death. I can feel time slipping away, but I'm not afraid anymore. I've written down everything I wish I had said, and I trust David to carry these words forward. Maybe the gift isn't in the saying, but in the passing along. Maybe each generation can learn from the previous one's silence and find their own voice. I pray David will be braver with his words than I was with mine. David closed the journal and sat in the quiet kitchen, feeling the weight of his father's love and regret settling around him like a warm blanket. The silence no longer felt empty, but full of possibility. He understood now that Robert's legacy wasn't just the practical skills he had taught or the work ethic he had modeled, but also the recognition that love unexpressed was love diminished. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah. When she answered, instead of his usual, "Hey, how's it going?" he said, "I called because I realized I don't tell you enough how grateful I am that you chose to build a life with me. You make everything better just by being yourself." The surprise in Sarah's voice was followed quickly by warmth. "That's beautiful," she said. "What brought this on?" "My father," David replied, looking around the kitchen where Robert had spent countless hours. "He's still teaching me things." 6 months after discovering his father's journal, David found himself facing the biggest challenge of his professional life. The construction company he had worked for since college was struggling financially, and layoffs seemed inevitable. As the newest project manager, David knew his position was vulnerable. The stress was affecting his sleep, his appetite, and his patience with Emma's bedtime questions. On a particularly difficult Thursday evening, after receiving news that 3 colleagues had been let go, David sat in his home office staring at his father's journal. He had been reading random entries whenever he needed guidance, and tonight felt like one of those moments. The page fell open to a section he hadn't noticed before, titled, "When the Ground Shifts Beneath Your Feet." "David was 8 when I lost my first job," Robert had written. "The construction company I worked for went bankrupt overnight, and I was suddenly unemployed with a mortgage, car payments, and a family depending on me. I remember the fear that kept me awake at night, the shame of having to apply for unemployment benefits, the way I snapped at your mother over trivial things because I felt like I was failing as a provider." David felt a chill of recognition. He had no memory of this period in his childhood, which meant his father had successfully shielded him from the crisis. But reading about Robert's internal struggle made David's current situation feel less isolating. "What I learned during those 3 months of unemployment," the entry continued, "was that losing a job doesn't mean losing your identity. I had defined myself so completely by my work that I forgot I was also a husband, a father, a friend, and a man with skills that extended beyond any single employer. The job loss forced me to remember who I was when I wasn't wearing a hard hat." The words hit David like a revelation. He realized he had been making the same mistake, allowing his job title to become his entire sense of self-worth. When he introduced himself at social gatherings, he led with his profession. When people asked about his life, he talked about projects and deadlines before mentioning his family or personal interests. The journal entry continued with practical advice that felt remarkably relevant. "I used the unemployment time to learn new skills, to spend extra hours with you and your mother, and to reassess what I actually wanted from my career. When I finally found work again, it was with a smaller company that valued my experience and treated employees like human beings rather than interchangeable parts. The job loss, which felt like a disaster at the time, actually redirected me toward a better path." David closed the journal and went downstairs to find Sarah tucking Emma into bed. He paused in the doorway, watching his wife patiently answer their daughter's seemingly endless questions about why stars shine and whether animals dream. The scene filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with professional success or financial security. "Daddy!" Emma called when she spotted him. "Mommy was just telling me about the pictures in my brain when I sleep." "Dreams," Sarah explained, with a smile. "We were discussing dreams." David sat on the edge of Emma's bed, struck by an idea. "Emma, what do you dream about when you dream about Daddy?" Emma scrunched up her face in concentration, a habit she had inherited from Robert. I Dream about you building me a treehouse and teaching me to use the big hammer like Grandpa did. And sometimes I dream about you reading me stories with different voices for all the characters." "Those sound like wonderful dreams," David said, his throat tightening. "What if I told you that starting tomorrow, I'm going to have more time to make some of those dreams come true?" Sarah looked at him questioningly, but David squeezed her hand reassuringly. He realized that regardless of what happened with his job, he wanted to be the father Emma dreamed about, not just the one who worked late and worried about things beyond a 5-year-old's understanding. The next morning, David requested a meeting with his supervisor to discuss his position at the company. Instead of waiting anxiously for a decision to be made about his future, he chose to participate in shaping it. He explained that he understood the company's financial difficulties and proposed a creative solution, transitioning to part-time consulting work that would allow the company to retain his expertise while reducing overhead costs. To his surprise, his supervisor was receptive to the idea. The construction industry was seasonal anyway, and having experienced consultants available during busy periods while reducing full-time salary costs made business sense. David left the meeting with a plan that would provide financial stability, while giving him the flexibility to explore other opportunities. That evening, he started construction on Emma's treehouse using tools from Robert's workshop that he had inherited. As they worked together, measuring boards and sorting screws, Emma chattered constantly about her day, her friends, and her theories about why birds don't get dizzy when they fly upside down. "Daddy," she said suddenly, "you seem different today." "Happy different?" David paused his hammering to look at his daughter. Her observation was startlingly perceptive. He did feel different, lighter somehow, as if he had been carrying a weight he hadn't realized was there. "I think you're right, sweetheart. I realized today that being your daddy is more important than any job I could ever have." Emma beamed at this declaration. "Will you still teach me to use the big hammer?" "Absolutely. But first you have to master the small hammer, just like Grandpa taught me." As they continued working, David found himself sharing stories about Robert that he had never told Emma before. Stories from the journal about his father's fears and dreams, his struggles and victories. Emma listened intently, asking questions that revealed she was processing these new insights about her grandfather as a complex human being rather than just the indulgent grandpa she remembered. Was Grandpa scared when he lost his job? Emma asked, her small hands helping to steady a board while David marked measurements. "Yes, he was," David answered honestly. "But being scared doesn't mean you stop trying. It means you find new ways to take care of the people you love." "Like building tree houses?" David laughed, delighted by her logic. Exactly like building tree houses. That night, after Emma was asleep, David and Sarah sat on their back porch looking at the partially constructed treehouse. Sarah had been supportive of his career change, but he could sense her underlying worry about their financial future. "I found something in Dad's journal today," David said, pulling her closer. "Something about how losing a job can actually open doors you never knew existed. I know the uncertainty is scary, but I feel like I'm finally making choices instead of just reacting to circumstances." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "You've been different since you started reading that journal. More present. More willing to talk about difficult things." "Dad spent his whole life struggling to find the right words," David explained. "Reading his thoughts has shown me that I don't want to make the same mistake. I want Emma to know not just that I love her, but why I love her, how proud I am of her curiosity and kindness and determination." "And what about me?" Sarah asked with a playful smile. "What do you want me to know?" David turned to face her fully, remembering his father's advice about expressing love clearly and specifically. "I want you to know that your strength during my father's illness showed me what real partnership looks like. I want you to know that watching you with Emma makes me fall in love with you all over again every day." And I want you to know that whatever happens with work or money or any of the practical stuff, you and Emma are my real success story." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "That journal is quite a gift," she said. "It really is," David agreed, thinking about how his father's words were continuing to guide him toward becoming the man, husband, and father he wanted to be. The treehouse would be finished soon, but the real construction project, building a family legacy of open communication and expressed love, was just beginning. 2 years after Robert's death, Emma turned 7, and David found himself confronting a parenting challenge that sent him straight back to his father's journal. Emma had started asking difficult questions about death, particularly about why Grandpa had to die and where he went afterward. Her questions became more frequent after her classmate's grandmother passed away, and David struggled to provide answers that were both honest and comforting. "Why did God take Grandpa away from us?" Emma asked one evening during their bedtime reading routine. Her question was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone children use for their most profound inquiries, but David could see the genuine confusion in her eyes. David set down the book they had been reading and gathered Emma closer. This was exactly the kind of moment his father had written about, opportunities for meaningful conversation that could either deepen their relationship or become missed connections due to inadequate responses. "That's a really important question, sweetheart," David said, buying himself time to formulate a thoughtful answer. "What do you think about it?" "I think maybe God needed Grandpa to help build houses in heaven," Emma replied seriously. "But I think God should have asked us first, because we still needed him here." The innocence and logic of her response nearly broke David's heart. That evening, after Emma finally fell asleep, he searched through his father's journal for guidance on discussing difficult topics with children. He found what he was looking for in a section titled, "The Questions That Matter Most." When David was about Emma's age, Robert had written, he asked me why his goldfish died. I gave him some generic explanation about fish getting old. But what I should have said was that death is part of life, and that loving someone means accepting that our time with them is precious because it's limited. I should have told him that when someone dies, they live on in our memories and in the ways we choose to honor them. The entry continued with Robert's reflections on his own father's death when David was 12. David remembered the day clearly. His father's sudden absence from work, the hushed phone conversations, the funeral where Robert had stood stone-faced and silent. What David hadn't known was the internal struggle Robert was experiencing. "I didn't know how to grieve in front of my son," the journal revealed. "I thought showing emotion would scare him or make him think I couldn't protect him from life's hardships. So I mourned privately and tried to carry on as if nothing had changed." What a mistake that was. David needed to see that it's normal and healthy to feel sad when someone you love dies. He needed to understand that grief is love with nowhere to go. This insight crystallized something David had been feeling but couldn't articulate. Emma's questions about death weren't just intellectual curiosity. They were her way of processing grief and trying to understand her place in a world where people she loved could disappear. She needed him to model how to handle loss with both honesty and hope. The next day, David made an unexpected decision. Instead of dropping Emma off at school as usual, he called in to let them know she would be late and drove to the cemetery, where Robert was buried. Emma had attended the funeral, but they hadn't visited the gravesite since the burial. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Emma asked as they pulled through the cemetery gates. "We're going to visit Grandpa," David replied. "I thought it might help us talk about some of those questions you've been asking." Emma was unusually quiet as they walked to Robert's grave. The headstone was simple, engraved with his name, dates, and the phrase, "Beloved Father and Grandfather." David had chosen those words quickly during his grief-stricken state, but now he realized they didn't capture the complexity of who Robert had been. Is Grandpa really under there? Emma asked, staring at the grave with wide eyes. His body is, David explained, settling cross-legged on the grass and pulling Emma down beside him. But the part of Grandpa that made him special, his love for us, his memories, his jokes, the way he taught us things, that part is still with us. Emma considered this carefully. Like how I still remember the song he used to sing when he pushed me on the swing? Exactly like that. And like how, you know how to measure wood the way he taught you, and how you scrunch up your nose when you're thinking hard just like he did. They sat quietly for a few minutes, Emma tracing patterns in the grass, while David thought about his father's words regarding grief and love. Finally, Emma spoke again. I miss him, Daddy. Is it okay to feel sad about it? David felt a surge of gratitude toward his father's journal for preparing him for this moment. It's not just okay to feel sad. It's important. Being sad when someone dies means you loved them, and love is the best thing we can feel for another person. Are you sad too? Emma asked, leaning against his side. Very sad, David admitted. I miss talking to Grandpa and asking him for advice. I miss watching him teach you things and seeing how happy you made him. But I'm also grateful that I got to be his son and that you got to be his granddaughter. Emma was quiet again, processing this information. Then she surprised him with her next question. Will you write me letters like Grandpa wrote you? David's breath caught. He hadn't realized Emma knew about the journal. How did you know about Grandpa's letters? I heard you and Mommy talking about them. You said they help you know what to say when things are hard. David thought about this request seriously. The journal had been Robert's attempt to bridge the communication gap between them, written when time was running out. But Emma's suggestion opened up a different possibility. Ongoing written communication that could supplement rather than replace their daily conversations. Would you like me to write you letters? David asked. Yes, but not sad letters like Grandpa's, happy letters about fun things and how proud you are of me and why you love me. The simplicity of her request highlighted everything Robert had tried to teach him about expressing love clearly and frequently. Emma didn't want to wait until she was an adult to know how her father felt about her. She wanted that affirmation, now, while she was still young enough to be shaped by it. I think that's a wonderful idea, David said. What if I wrote you a letter every month telling you about something special you did or something I learned from watching you grow? Emma's face lit up with excitement. And I could write you letters too. I'm getting really good at writing. As they walked back to the car, Emma chattering about what she might include in her first letter, David felt a shift in his understanding of his father's legacy. The journal hadn't just been about completing unfinished emotional business. It had been about breaking a family pattern of unexpressed love and creating new traditions of open communication. That evening, David sat down to write Emma's first letter. Instead of waiting for a significant occasion or a moment of crisis, he decided to capture an ordinary day and explain why it mattered to him. He wrote about her curiosity during their cemetery visit, her compassion for others experiencing loss, and her natural ability to find hope in difficult situations. When he finished the letter, David realized he was creating something he wished he had received as a child, regular affirmation that he was seen, valued, and loved not just for his achievements but for his intrinsic worth as a unique human being. Emma would grow up knowing exactly how her father felt about her, not through grand gestures or crisis conversations, but through consistent, intentional communication that honored both her present self and her developing identity. The pattern of silence that had characterized the Matthews men for generations was finally being broken, replaced with words that celebrated love instead of hiding it, that built bridges instead of allowing distance, that created legacy through expressed emotion rather than unexpressed regret. As David sealed Emma's letter in an envelope decorated, With stickers she had chosen earlier, he could almost hear his father's approval echoing across time. A whisper of gratitude that the words he had struggled to find were now flowing freely to the next generation. When Emma turned 12, David faced a challenge he hadn't anticipated. The sweet, curious child who had once hung on his every word was now rolling her eyes at his attempts at meaningful conversation and spending more time texting friends than talking to family. The monthly letters that had delighted her at 7 now seemed to embarrass her, though she still kept them in a special box in her room. "She's just growing up," Sarah reminded him one evening after Emma had brushed off his offer to help with homework. "This is normal." But David felt the familiar ache of missed connections that his father had written about so eloquently. He found himself turning to Robert's journal more frequently, searching for guidance on navigating the turbulent waters of raising a teenager. "I failed with David during his teenage years," one entry confessed. "I thought his pulling away meant he didn't need me anymore, so I gave him space when what he actually needed was consistent engagement. I was so afraid of being rejected that I stopped trying to connect, which guaranteed the very rejection I feared." The observation stung because David recognized himself making similar assumptions. When Emma didn't respond enthusiastically to his questions about school, he had started asking fewer questions. When she seemed annoyed by his presence during homework time, he had begun leaving her alone more often. Robert's journal contained a section titled "The Teenager Translation Guide," which made David smile despite his frustration. His father had apparently been more observant during David's adolescence than David had realized. When teenage David said, "I don't need help," what he meant was, "I need help, but I'm scared to look incompetent," one entry explained. When he said, "You wouldn't understand," what he meant was, "Please try to understand because I'm confused and scared, but I don't know how to ask for guidance without seeming childish." This insight prompted David to reconsider his approach with Emma. Maybe her eye-rolling and dismissive comments weren't actually rejection, but rather her way of testing whether he would keep trying to connect, despite her defensive behavior. The breakthrough came during an unexpected moment. David was in the kitchen making coffee when he heard Emma crying in her room. His instinct was to knock and offer help, but her recent pattern of pushing him away made him hesitate. Then he remembered his father's words about the teenage years, requiring persistence rather than retreat. He knocked gently on her door. "Em, everything okay?" "Go away," came the muffled response. "I'm fine." Instead of leaving, David sat down in the hallway outside her room. "I'm going to sit here for a few minutes," he called through the door. "You don't have to talk to me, but I want you to know I'm available if you need me." After several minutes of silence, Emma's door opened slightly. "Why are you sitting on the floor?" "Because my daughter sounded upset. And even if she doesn't want to talk about it right now, I want her to know she's not alone," David replied, not moving from his spot on the carpet. Emma studied his face for a long moment, then opened the door wider and sat down across from him in the hallway. "Madison told everyone about something I told her in private. Now the whole 7th grade thinks I'm a baby because I still sleep with Grandpa's old teddy bear sometimes." David felt a surge of protective anger toward Madison, followed immediately by gratitude that Emma had chosen to share this with him. He remembered Robert's advice about listening more than trying to fix things during emotional conversations. "That must feel like a real betrayal," he said simply. "It does," Emma said, fresh tears starting. "And I know it's stupid to care what they think, but I do. I don't want to be different or weird, but I also don't want to stop doing things that make me feel safe." David's heart ached for his daughter's dilemma. The teddy bear had been Robert's last gift to Emma, given to her during one of his final hospital visits. She had treasured it not as a toy, but as a connection to her grandfather's love. "It's not stupid at all," David said gently. "Caring about how others see us is part of being human. But Madison was wrong to share something private. And those kids don't understand the real story behind that bear." "What do you mean?" Emma asked, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. David thought carefully about his words, remembering his father's journal entries about the importance of sharing family stories that help children understand their place in a larger narrative. "That bear represents something really special," he explained. "Grandpa gave it to you because he wanted you to remember that you're loved even when the people who love you aren't physically present. Keeping it close doesn't make you a baby. It makes you someone who understands the value of love and memory." Emma considered this, her tears slowing. "Did you have something like that when you were my age?" David smiled, remembering. "I had Grandpa's old work gloves. When he died, I used to sleep with them under my pillow because they still smelled like his aftershave. I was actually older than you are now, but I was embarrassed about it too." "Really?" Emma's eyes widened. "What happened to them?" "I still have them," David admitted. "They're in a box in my closet, along with some of his tools and his journal. Sometimes when I'm facing something difficult, I hold those gloves and remember how strong his hands were, how capable he was of fixing things." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. "Dad, can I ask you something without you getting upset?" "Of course." "Why did you stop writing me letters? Did I do something wrong?" The question hit David like a physical blow. He had gradually stopped the monthly letters as Emma entered middle school, assuming she had outgrown them. He hadn't realized she had noticed the absence or interpreted it as disappointment in her. "Oh, sweetheart, no," David said, reaching for her hands. "You didn't do anything wrong at all. I stopped because I thought you might find them embarrassing now that you're older. I was trying to give you space to grow up. But I liked the letters," Emma said quietly. "They made me feel special. Even when I acted like they were dumb, I always read them like 5 times and kept them all." David felt tears prick his own eyes as he realized he had made exactly the mistake his father had warned against, interpreting normal teenage development as rejection and responding by withdrawing instead of adapting his approach. "What if we started them again?" he suggested. "Maybe they could be different now, less about little kid things and more about the person you're becoming." Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile he had seen from her in weeks. "Could. You write about serious stuff too, like how to deal with friend drama and why growing up feels so confusing sometimes." "I would love to write about those things," David said, thinking about how Robert would have cherished this opportunity for honest communication with his teenage son. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah calling them for dinner, but something fundamental had shifted between them. As they stood up from the hallway floor, Emma surprised David by hugging him tightly. "Thanks for not giving up on me," she whispered. "Never," David whispered back. "Even when you're 90 and I'm really, really old, I'll still want to know what's happening in your life." That night, David returned to his father's journal with renewed purpose. He found a section he had previously overlooked, titled "The Long View of Parenting." "Raising a child is like tending a garden that takes decades to mature," Robert had written. "You plant seeds of values and love when they're young, water them consistently through the middle years even when you can't see growth happening, and, eventually, if you're patient and persistent, you get to witness the flowering of the person they were meant to become." The entry continued with Robert's regrets about not staying connected during David's teenage years, but it also contained hope. "Maybe it's not too late. Maybe the seeds I planted early are still viable, just dormant. Maybe consistent effort now could still yield a harvest of closeness in our later years." David realized that Robert had been trying to reconnect during those final months, not just through the journal but through increased attention to Emma, through attempts at deeper conversations, through the vulnerability he had shown in the hospital. The cancer diagnosis had given him urgency, but the desire for connection had always been there. Inspired by his father's words and his breakthrough conversation with Emma, David made a decision. He would restart the letters, but he would also be more intentional about creating opportunities for natural connection. Instead of waiting for Emma to come to him with problems, he would position himself in her world more consistently, available, but not intrusive, interested, but not invasive. The next morning, he found Emma in the kitchen before school, eating cereal while scrolling through her phone. "Mind if I sit with you while you eat?" he asked, pouring himself coffee. Emma looked up, surprised. "You don't usually eat breakfast." "I'm thinking of starting," David said, settling across from her with a piece of toast. "What's on your schedule today?" Instead of the usual one-word answers, Emma actually told him about her science project, her concern about an upcoming math test, and her excitement about tryouts for the school play. As she talked, David listened actively, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested in her answers. When she finished breakfast and gathered her backpack, Emma paused at the kitchen door. "Dad, that conversation last night helped a lot. Thanks for sitting in the hallway until I was ready to talk." "Any time," David said, meaning it completely. "That's what dads are for." As Emma headed off to school, David pulled out his laptop and began composing her first new letter in over a year. This time, instead of writing about his pride in her accomplishments, he wrote about his admiration for her courage in navigating the complex world of seventh-grade friendships, her loyalty to things that mattered to her even when others didn't understand, and his confidence in her ability to become exactly who she was meant to be. The pattern of connection was being rewoven, stronger than before because it was built on mutual choice rather than childhood dependence. Robert's whispers across time had guided David through another crucial parenting transition, helping him understand that love requires adaptation, but never abandonment, persistence, but never pressure, presence, but never intrusion. The legacy was continuing, evolving with each generation, but maintaining its essential message: that love expressed clearly and consistently creates bonds that can weather any storm. 20 years had passed since Robert's death, and David found himself in a hospital room once again, but this time the circumstances were joyful. Emma, now 25 and radiant despite her exhaustion, had just given birth to her first child, a daughter they had named Grace Elizabeth, with the middle name honoring Robert's mother. As David held his granddaughter for the first time, feeling the familiar weight of new life in his arms, he was struck by the cyclical nature of family legacy. This tiny person would never meet her great-grandfather, but she would inherit the love he had struggled to express, filtered through generations that had learned to speak more freely from the heart. "She looks like Dad did as a baby," Emma said softly, watching David cradle Grace. "Same serious expression, like she's already trying to figure out how the world works." David smiled, remembering the baby photos his mother had shown him of Robert. Emma was right. Grace had that same intense, thoughtful look that seemed to run in the Matthews family line. "Have I ever told you about the box of letters I wrote you over the years?" Emma asked suddenly. David looked up, confused. "What letters?" Emma laughed, wincing slightly from the effort. "I started writing you letters when I was 8, after you began writing to me. I never gave them to you because I thought it might be weird, but I kept writing them anyway. They're all in a box in my apartment. Letters about everything from middle school drama to college heartbreaks to meeting James and falling in love." The revelation stunned David. His daughter had been carrying on a one-sided correspondence with him for 17 years, processing her life experiences through written words just as Robert had done in his journal. "What did you write about?" David asked, shifting Grace to his other arm as she made soft, cooing sounds. "Everything," Emma said with a smile. "When I was angry with you for being overprotective, I wrote letters explaining why I needed more freedom. When I was scared about starting high school, I wrote about how your stories about Grandpa gave me courage. When I graduated college and realized how much you had sacrificed to support my education, I wrote about my gratitude and how I hope to make you proud." James, Emma's husband, spoke up from his chair in the corner where he had been quietly observing. "She still writes them. I found her writing you a letter at 2 in the morning last week when she couldn't sleep because she was nervous about becoming a mom." David felt tears pricking his eyes as he processed this information. The tradition of written communication that Robert had started as an act of desperation had evolved into something beautiful and ongoing in the next generation. "I'd love to read those letters someday," David said. "If you're willing to share them." "Actually," Emma said, reaching for a bag beside her hospital bed, "I brought something for you." She pulled out a leather journal, smaller than Robert's, but bound in similar worn leather. "I had this made for you. It's copies of all the letters I never sent, organized chronologically. I thought maybe now that you're going to be a grandfather, you might want to understand how your father's words traveled through you to me and will continue traveling through me to Grace." David accepted the journal with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected gift and its significance. 3 generations of Matthew's family members had now used written words to bridge emotional gaps and preserve love across time. That evening, after Emma and James had settled in for their first night as parents, David sat in the hospital waiting room and opened his daughter's journal. The first entry was dated when she was 8 years old, written in careful cursive with frequent spelling errors. "Dear Daddy, today you wrote me a letter about how proud you are that I helped Mrs. Johnson when she fell down. I wanted to write back that helping people feels good in my chest, like when you hug me after a bad dream. I think Grandpa would be proud too because you always say he liked to help people build things." The letters chronicled Emma's growing understanding of family dynamics, her gradual comprehension of Robert's influence on David's parenting style, and her own developing philosophy about love and communication. As she grew older, the entries became more sophisticated, but retained the essential honesty that made them so powerful. One letter, written during her senior year of high school, particularly moved David. "Dear Daddy, I know you worry about me, going away to college, but I want you to know that everything important you taught me is coming with me. Not just the practical stuff like how to change a tire or balance a checkbook, but the big things too, like how love means showing up consistently, not just during the dramatic moments. Like how saying, 'I'm proud of you' can change someone's whole day. Like how admitting when you're scared or uncertain doesn't make you weak, it makes you human." The letter continued. "I read Grandpa's journal sometimes when you're not home. You probably don't know that, but Mom said it was okay. Reading his words helps me understand why you work so hard to tell me how you feel instead of assuming I know. I want you to know that I see your effort, and it matters. I never have to guess if you love me or wonder what you think about the person I'm becoming." David had to pause in his reading, overwhelmed by the realization that his conscious efforts to break his family's pattern of unexpressed love had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. Emma hadn't just received his words, she had internalized their importance and begun creating her own tradition of thoughtful communication. Another letter, written after her college graduation, revealed Emma's understanding of the broader family legacy. "Dear Daddy, today at graduation, when you hugged me and whispered that Grandpa would be so proud, I realized something important. The reason our family stories matter isn't because they're perfect or because everyone always said the right thing. They matter because they show how love finds a way to continue even when people struggle to express it. Grandpa's silence taught you the value of words. Your words are teaching me the value of intentional communication. Maybe someday I'll teach my children something even better." The final entry was recent, written just days before Grace's birth. "Dear Daddy, I'm about to become a mother, which means you're about to become a grandfather. I've been thinking about the circle of love that connects Grandpa to you, to me, to this baby who's about to arrive. Each generation seems to get a little better at loving out loud, at saying the important things while there's still time to say them. I want to raise my daughter with all the wonderful traditions you started, the monthly letters, the honest conversations about difficult topics, the way you make everyone feel seen and valued. But I also want to add something new. I want to teach her that love isn't just something you express, It's something you actively create through every choice you make about how to treat the people who matter to you. David closed the journal and sat quietly in the hospital waiting room, feeling the weight of 3 generations of love and learning. Robert's whispered words of regret had traveled through time to create a legacy of intentional communication that would now be passed to Grace. The next morning, he knocked softly on Emma's hospital room door, finding her nursing Grace, while James dozed in the uncomfortable chair beside them. "I read your letters," David said quietly, settling into the chair on the other side of her bed. Emma looked up with a slightly nervous expression. "What did you think?" "I think your great-grandfather would be amazed by the conversation he started," David replied, "and I think you're going to be an incredible mother." "I hope so," Emma said, adjusting Grace's position. "I want to do for her what you did for me. Make sure she never has to wonder how I feel about her." David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "I brought you something. It's blank, but I thought maybe you might want to start writing letters to Grace, the way I wrote to you." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the notebook. "Will you help me? I mean, will you write to her too, so she grows up with letters from both her mom and her grandpa?" "I would love nothing more," David said, thinking about how Robert would have treasured such an opportunity. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Grace opened her eyes and looked directly at David. In her serious, thoughtful expression, he could see echoes of Robert, of Emma as a child, and of all the Matthews family members who had struggled to find the right words to express the depth of their love. But Grace would grow up in a different world, one where love was spoken freely, where difficult conversations were approached with patience and honesty, where family stories were shared as gifts rather than hidden as burdens. She would inherit not just the genetic traits that connected her to previous generations, but also the accumulated wisdom of a family that had learned, through trial and error, how to love out loud. David took Grace's tiny hand in his, marveling at the delicate perfection of her fingers. "Hello, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'm your grandfather, and I have so many things I want to tell you. But don't worry. Unlike your great-grandfather, I'm not going to wait until it's almost too late to say them." Emma smiled through her tears, understanding that her father's words were both a promise to Grace and a completion of the circle that Robert had started with his dying whisper. The legacy would continue, enriched by each generation's contribution, carried forward by soft words that held the power to transform silence into song, regret into hope, and love unexpressed into love that would echo through time.